great. Thanks for finally coming on the show. I'm glad our schedules were able to line up. This is great. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
Okay, great. I'm Cecile Leroux, and I am with UKG, which is the Ultimate Chronos Group. It's a large organization, and one of the things that we are most excited about, and I'll get to what I'm passionate about, but the organization is a leader in HR, HCM, people solutions, as well as workforce management solutions, and bringing those two things together, systems of work and people systems, in a very unique way, to create what we are calling life work technology. And that's an important thing that I am passionate about. It'll lead to that. I'm passionate about people. I started out as an anthropologist. I was an economic
anthropologist. That is the best background for an HR person, by the way. I just have to say to you.
You know,
Understanding humans is the way to go.
And sort of micro cultures, looking at how organizations create these sorts of, I don't like the word subculture. It implies sort of a hierarchy that isn't necessary, but the idea that individuals will sort of group themselves, sometimes by team, other times in completely different ways, by affinity, other kinds of interests, those sorts of things. And how those different microcultures interact is, I think, absolutely critical to understanding what I will call the traditional workplace. And I think that's an important distinction, because as we start looking to the future, there's the workplace is probably one of the areas that has been upended more than any other. So we'll get to that. But I'm actually passionate about people in the workplace. And that's an interesting thing, because a lot of organizations and even people who are in the software business are more focused on productivity and on systems that help people be more productive, without necessarily understanding some of the interactions that actually lead to better productivity without a forced sense of that. So as an anthropologist, an economic anthropologist, I was an archaeologist for a while also. So I went from stones and bones to people, and I never turned.
Did you have the full Indiana Jones outfit too, with the whip and everything?
I still have my trawl. I've got, I still, keep that with me. I haven't gotten it plated or anything, but yeah, it's interesting. It does change the way you look at rocks for the rest of your life, though.
Fantastic. I don't think I've ever met an archaeologist. This is great. How long did you do that for?
So I did it for when I was in graduate school, and I did Mayan archaeology. I spent a lot of time in Copan in Honduras, actually, and it was in the 90s. I'm gonna date myself a little bit, late 80s and 90s. And so for those of you who know a little bit about the history of Central America, that's when the Contras were pretty active. So it was an interesting time to be there, sort of making sure that you changed your patterns and your behaviors to not be traceable, all of those sorts of things. And then I went to the Philippines and had to do more of that, actually, there as well. But yeah, I think that also lends sort of a perspective to the importance of globalization and variety and difference in the workforce, that I think is the strength of any group of people or workforce. So
that's super interesting. So I guess the archaeology actually informed some of the anthropology that you did as well, right? Because you got to see, firsthand and touch history, basically, right?
Absolutely. And what's considered history, because as we all know, history is in itself interpretation. It's not law. It's not hard and fast. There are certainly facts associated with it, but it was that. But what I recognized is I was spending more time talking to the archaeologists, the folks that were actually digging along with me. I would draw. We'd find something and we'd have to draw it. But having those interactions and understanding sort of who had first done archaeology there was far more interesting to me even than the stones and bones themselves.
Interesting. And that's what led you into anthropology?
Absolutely. Yep.
Very cool.
Yeah. Circuitous path to technology, but sometimes I think that it does bring, the other thing about anthropology is anthropologists are by definition observers, whether we're participant observers or simply observers of culture and interactions. And so I think you bring that into the world of technology, and you immediately have a different perspective, which I think is a person-centered perspective.
Yeah.
It's like, well, how is this impacting people or these groups?
Yeah, well, that would happen. My nephew at one point said that he wanted to take anthropology, and his father was like, what are you doing that for? Take business or something else that's more useful. I'm like, what are you talking about? Anthropology is the most useful thing you can take because it helps you to understand humans. I mean, and everything stems from that.
Yeah, I know. We recently hired another anthropologist, actually, who is studying accessibility and bringing accessibility research into our development teams as sort of and also quality analyst work. So there's a lot of it. All you anthropologists out there, you know, come and join the tech world.
Google's hiring you, Facebook's hiring you, you're tech companies, they want you.
Exactly.
It's not STEM anymore.
It's true. It's not a weird, you know,
it's not a weird thing
for nothing. Yeah, exactly. So
very cool, very cool. So I love the concept. So you're talking about groups.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting because, I mean, originally we all associated ourselves with people who we were with geographically, right?
Yeah.
And since then, I mean, everything's broken down. We don't have that anymore. We still have workplaces and homes and, you know, the villages and towns and cities that we live in. So we still have that geographic thing, but we can now have affinity with anyone, anywhere, globally. So, I mean, how has that changed the way humans act?
So I think of this, it's really, really interesting. I think of the world that we're living in as both a post-temporal and a post-geographic world, world of work, right? And if you, and you know, it sounds a little cataclysmic, maybe even dystopian when you think of it that way, but I actually don't. I think that it's incredibly liberating. We are so often bound, although I can't help but notice, you know, you've got your Stanford flag in the back, and that's one of those ways that we have affinities with other people. You see somebody walking down the street with, you know, with a jersey that is either your school or one that you're familiar with, that you care about, and you'll just talk to someone randomly. And if not, you wouldn't necessarily do that. So we do have to find other ways of connecting with people in this post-temporal, post-geographic, because at the same time, you know, the whole idea of when people work, I've got one of my, you know, favorite colleagues, a wonderful, wonderful person, doesn't really get started until about, her mind really kicks into high gear at 4 p.m.
Wow.
The nice thing is I can, you know, so a 9 a.m. meeting is brutal for her. But the nice thing is I know that if I'm up for some reason at 1 or 2 in the morning, she'll be up and she can answer questions. And so that idea, I think what that requires, so it gives us freedom, but it also requires a level of understanding. And it's the kind of understanding of preferences, of what works well for individuals or doesn't, that we're not used to capturing or starting our digital conversations with.
Right.
As an example, when you go through an interview process, how often does someone say, tell me about your communication preferences? Do you prefer text? Would you prefer, you know, email? God forbid email right now.
I've never been asked that.
Nobody asks that. And yet, isn't that one of the most important things if you're going to be getting in touch with someone that you could ask?
Yeah.
And so I think it forces a certain level of sort of definition and a little bit of reflection on what does actually work for you. And then being able to say, you know what? This particular way of working, I'll give you an example. Some of the accessibility work that we have done recently has demonstrated that for people who are oftentimes people who are on the autism spectrum, being able to select out of being on video is an enormous sort of unblocker of their work, and being able to interact in ways that they wouldn't be able to necessarily. And so, you know, that sort of latitude only comes from an understanding. So if a leader or manager doesn't ask about that, they're never going to get to a place where someone will be comfortable saying it. I generally am like, look, if you want to get a hold of me, I'm not going to check my email until the end of the day. That's just how things work right now, because I'm on video and I think it's disrespectful and I don't like, you know, sort of trying to over multitask. So text me if you want to get a hold of me. It's the only way. And you know, perhaps that started when I was trying to connect with my children when they were in high school and college, and you know, it's still the only way that but I think it does force that. So I think there are ways that we connect, but it does require us to understand how we prefer to connect, and it requires people to be comfortable sort of defining what the right kind of connection patterns mean, and I think that's going to become really, really important, honestly, as we look beyond the next 5 years, because I think the next 5 years are going to be brutally difficult for organizations, and for people trying to figure out, you know, I again, not to be too negative about it, but I do think that, you know, we are starting to see the death of the knowledge worker factory, which is what I would call a traditional workplace, an office. It's a knowledge worker factory. And so clearly there will be environments in manufacturing, in school settings, although schools are another thing that need to be completely redefined.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah, we can get to that at some point. But I think that though that is going to really, really force a rethinking. And I read an article not too long ago, I think it was even last week, about how Google is rethinking offices and robotic, you know, walls that will pop up and they're inflatable to give people privacy. But that still presupposes, in the same way that technology presupposes that the fundamental is that there is an office.
Right.
That's a given. And so we just have to make that better, make that more flexible, make that more hybrid. And I think that that's probably not going far enough, because the shift fundamentally for people is far greater. And as we often see, there's a disconnect between where people are and where organizations, structures, you know, and even definitions of leadership are. And I think that discomfort and that dissonance is going to continue to be a problem.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think geographically, I think probably for the last 5 or 6 years, I would never start an organization that wasn't virtual.
Yeah.
Right. Because you don't really need sort of those physical assets to be there all the time, available for you to travel to. I mean, there's just so much cost that could be saved if we did that. I mean, I did a study for one of my classes where they were talking about, you know, what are the upside. We did like an argument on working from home, or working from anywhere compared to working in an office. And we only found one downside to working from anywhere, which was you don't get some serendipitous connections because all communications has to be intentional, right? But everything else was an upside. The commute, the health, the time, everything was an upside. So it really needs a radical rethinking, because I think too many people are starting to go back and say, well, we need to go back to this steady state that we were in before, but that wasn't ever the optimal state. So we need to figure out a new optimal state and get to that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think of that in the same way, actually, as we look at technology in service of people, because we still create technology in service of transactions.
Exactly.
And efficiency, and not at all in service of people. And, you know, even your phone is super, super clunky.
Oh yeah.
You have to go to an app. You've got to update. You've got to do all this, and it doesn't matter. We're not going to get into the you know the war of which, you know, the brand war or even the device war. But I think that really is one of those things that that has to be rethought. It's not about transactions. It is about an experience. And now there's this whole movement, and it's interesting to see. You're seeing in business software, it's all about experience. It's human experience management. It's all this. And yet I don't think, you know, and everyone's got a marketplace and an experience platform all of a sudden. And when you dig a little deeper, what you see is you've got ways of sort of facilitating productivity increases still, and it's still at the service of work.
Yeah.
And that is what has fundamentally got to shift. If you talk to anyone, and I get requests on a daily basis, I'd like to go virtual permanently. I'd like to go virtual permanently. And I think to myself, yeah, I'm not losing a single person on this. This is, that is not worth losing anyone, because the reality is that I believe that I work in some cases more and longer hours. And it's been shown, actually, we have a problem unplugging, in fact, which is something that we're going to have to get to also. But
yeah, we've swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. Right?
I think we have, and you sort of have to force some of that. And you're right, it's the serendipitous sort of connections that can happen. But at the same time, what are we trying to achieve with artificial intelligence? And what's been the holy grail is intention. And we're trying to understand user intention.
We're still trying to figure out what those brains are thinking, right?
Exactly. And so, perhaps it's not the worst thing to give up. Yes, there are serendipitous meetings that can happen, but you know what? You can simulate that. And that's where we actually have to rethink what happens. It's if we could do more unstructured meetings, if you could actually, and we know that that's happening. It's that people right now are so fatigued from the medium, from the always on digital medium, that we're tired of trying out new things specifically that might sort of create that environment that I think is going to be really, really important.
Well, I'm curious how you mentioned that temporal thing earlier. It's like, how do you get teams to collaborate? I guess they do it all asynchronously, or do you, like, especially if you have global teams, it's almost impossible to get people all on the phone at the same time or on Zoom.
Well, I think that this requires, because we are in a post-temporal world, if we're really going to do things right. Here's the challenge: that there is always sort of a headquarters or a hub and spoke assumption.
Right.
And in that assumption, there's a power dynamic. And in that power dynamic, there's always someone who's caving, rather than it being, oh, it's rotational. By the way, you may not want to get up at 5 a.m. for a meeting with India, but that's what's going to happen for this month. And if you actually systematize it, because what ends up happening is you have people in, many, many colleagues. I'm using India just because we have a number of colleagues. And when you think about that, they are often the ones who, okay, we're going to eat and then I'll get back on and I'll have meetings in the evening. Well, that needs to be balanced. And it's not just about every single day having sort of an unhappy medium, which is what tends to happen. You're like, okay, well, I'll get up at 6 for a bunch of meetings, which is still too late and it's still too early. So I think there has to be sort of this, again, if we asked, who doesn't mind? Who's a night owl? All right, we're going to have you work as part of this team for a while and we're going to rotate. And I think, again, it's this understanding of people, which is why I believe deeply understanding people will be the next frontier in truly being able to understand and create work environments that work for people, because I don't really think that they have or do, honestly.
Yeah, because if you think about it, even our tools don't let us do that, right? I mean, if you look at something as simple as a calendar, right? Can you actually go in there and say, I want to set up a meeting that rotates between time zones? It's like, I want this to be 9 a.m. India time, this week, and then next week I want it to be 9 a.m. Eastern time. Next week I want it.
And how do you
support any of that?
And we also don't even ask. And show me all the people who would prefer to work later hours. Maybe that works better with their family schedule, with their partner's schedule. We don't ask those simple questions. And I think that's a huge problem. I also think that, that there's, that part of that also means not just understanding people, but also understanding the dynamics of a much more fluid workforce. The fact that people will lend their talents, and that individuals over the next few years, I believe, and even going into, if we look at, 10 years ahead as an example, I believe that people will fragment themselves, obviously not literally necessarily, but they're going to fragment. These are the talents that I'm going to lend here. And so this idea that it's not just gig work, it's a blend. It's sort of being able to say, this is where I really, really excel, and I'm going to share my talents here. But you know what? This kind of work is in a completely different realm, different industry, not even an industry. And it's something that I'm going to build up myself. This whole idea of giving all of yourself to one employer is a fallacy, and it will continue to be so, but it shouldn't be at the cost of people's health.
Yeah. And the problem is that, I've totally believed that as well. I think like every job is eventually going to be like Uber, where you say, I'm on, I'm off, right? I'm working for them or I'm not working for them. And
Yeah, yeah,
then the concept of having 5 jobs will be a positive thing. It's like, oh my God, that poor guy, he's got 5 jobs. No, this is good. You're working
yeah.
for all these companies, you're doing all these different things, and
And
you
you're
are in
learning.
control of your time and your
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
right? As opposed to the organizations that you're working for. But it's kind of like all the systems need to be disrupted for this thing to occur, because even today, I mean, good luck trying to get a mortgage if you are a gig worker, right?
Yeah,
They want to see a W-2 that's been
yeah,
solid for 2 years, right? So
yeah.
everything,
And that
all of
has
these
nothing to
systems need
do.
to take that into
Yeah.
account.
Yeah, and that has nothing to do, by the way, with whether or not someone is financially solvent.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
It has absolutely nothing to do with it. No, it's interesting because I remember meeting I talk to, I have this thing about talking to every Uber Lyft driver that,
I do the
and
same
I have,
thing. They have
yeah, and
their
it's
stories are so
fascinating.
interesting.
It is. Somebody's like, oh yeah, I used to be a payroll clerk. I'm like, you quit? Yeah, because I wanted to be able to spend time with my family and this worked better for me. Actually, I make more money doing this
Yeah.
because I decide when, and then when I'm not, and if it's not happening, then I won't. Like, wow. Like, who gets to choose? If it's a really bad, slow day, you don't get to choose. Hey, I'm out, done, see you later. If you're working in a retail environment, too bad that you just have to deal with that.
You just have to waste
Right?
your day sitting there.
Exactly. And I think that is something that the pandemic has actually shown people, is that there's a finite amount of time, and this experience that we're having right now is pretty precious. And I'm not gonna waste it necessarily. So if you think about it, there are more and more opportunities for us to sort of commercialize ourselves, almost extreme commercialization of the self, if you divide yourself in these different ways. And so I remember speaking to this Lyft driver who said, oh yeah, I just picked you up on my way back. I was checking in on a crew that I had that was doing some work, and then I also do some part-time accounting for my dad's business. And in fact, I do this dolly.com thing where, he was pretty buff. So he's like, yeah. And I just moved some older woman's furniture in her house. I was just like, wow, that's exhausting. He's like, no, it's actually awesome. I'm like, no, you know what? You're right.
Nice.
It is. And
nice.
it was that one example. And that was in a day that this guy was doing 5 different things. And he goes, yeah, but if I want to be off for 2 months, I can do that now.
Yeah. That's freedom. That's
and
freedom.
that was 4 years ago.
People,
it is.
For some people, it's slavery. It's like, oh my God, you got to work all the time. And for others, it's like, wait, this is exactly what I want. But that's what we need to provide. We need to provide that level of choice. Yeah. So that people can do whatever they want, and don't be judgmental and say, that's bad and this is good, right?
Exactly.
Everybody has their own preference.
That, by the way, is one of these interesting fundamental differences that you see, and that one of the fundamental changes that has to happen, in particular in leadership, the whole surveillance culture and leadership.
Oh yeah.
Now, clearly, in some parts of the world, a surveillance culture is quite normal. And so again, not to judge that, but in many instances, we can't have it both ways. In Canada, there was a study that was done not too long ago that 75% of managers claim that they trust their employees and they don't need to see what they're doing. However, about 50% of them would actually rather see their employees doing their work.
That number sounds totally wrong to me. I don't believe that for a second.
Exactly. And so you're thinking to yourself, yeah, you're absolutely talking out of both sides of your mouth. And then at the other sort of end of the spectrum is this idea that people are like, oh, you're a slave to your work. You're a workaholic. Well, I'm not necessarily a proponent of the grind culture at all costs. But when people say to me, I happen to be one of these people, I'm probably undiagnosed ADHD, to be honest. And I think, it's probably been one of the things that
anyone in the innovation space can say that.
Exactly. But one of the interesting things about that is I actually believe that is what makes me want to do things. And if I'm exhausted, my body will shut down, and that's okay. And I'm used to that cycle. But people are like, you don't want to burn out. Make sure I'm like, look, you don't understand how stressful it is for me to not have something done enough that I can relax.
Yeah.
And so for me, my work pattern is going to be completely different than someone else's. And it's not a bad thing. And if somebody tells me you're going to burn out, I'm like, you have no idea how I work. I will. This is how I work. I will burn myself out and then I'll rest. And you just have to be ready, by the way, for that intermittent burnout and rest cycle,
Yeah.
because I'll be very, very productive during that time, or I'll do a lot of things that are valuable. But I don't think that we have, again, there's too much stigma. There's a grind culture that works for some people. For other people who are like, no, actually, I'm really not into that. I want to have this pattern. It helps me feel more comfortable in my work. Well, then let that happen also. But this knowledge worker factory concept makes it almost impossible, because uniformity is what's celebrated. It's just like what's celebrated in our schools.
Yeah.
If you deviate from the norm by, if you think about it, schools are made for like the 50% that sits in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most remarkable and wonderful things about humanity is that we are so vastly different. And even if you look at the middle, it's only for certain things. And then everyone, if we were all really allowed to let our freak flag fly, we would have all sorts of fascinating things about each other. And that's where I think that there's still too much stigma that has to change to be able to make some of that happen. But I do think that the last year has actually been a generational kind of a shift. It has been an event, at least I certainly hope it has, such that we are in a place where we really, really can kickstart what needs to happen.
I hope so, because I think it sounds like what you're saying to me is that what we really need is some kind of radical acceptance. It's like people are who they are, and they work the way they work, and they live the way they live. But we just have so much, we judge other people and say, why aren't you working the way I want you to work? Why aren't you living the way I want you to live? If we just allowed that to happen, and I can't understand, like, that's one thing. And then the second thing is, I can't see how organizations of today, unless they morph drastically, are able to have workers that are just like that, who can be radically accepted.
And radically accepted, and then radically innovative too.
Yeah, exactly.
Because acceptance of oneself is also acceptance of a variety of ideas, whether they work or they don't, it doesn't matter, but they have to be generated somewhere. So when you sort of force innovation in a room, so to speak, then you're killing it at the same time.
So we're just going to go into this room and innovate, okay?
And innovate. Let's start by brainstorming. But I think because it's in those moments either of massive problem or in those moments of freedom of thought that radical innovations can happen, that the space is created or the pressure is there such that those things can happen. And I think that is something that the past year and a half really has created. People have had, in many ways, more time to think about different things. And I can't tell you how many people have said, you know what, I never, ever, ever would have gotten this amount of time with my child friend. There's been a lot of loss. There have been a lot of people who haven't seen others, but those who have also have had time to think differently about themselves and what a post-pandemic world is for them.
Right.
And that's something that we really, a lot of things slowed down tremendously, such that I think it forces some of that. And I hope that we'll be in a very, very different place. We have to be. I mean, I don't know if you are officially going to ask, or if you think about sort of what does 2031 look like?
Oh, I'm getting there.
Okay.
We're not there yet.
I don't want to jump ahead. Having heard some of your podcasts before, I know it's one of those things that's
we're getting
coming.
there. So I still want to go back to how do organizations have to change, though, for this to occur? Because it's kind of like they have their mission to do X. Like, let's say, for example, a bank, right? Yeah. How does a bank deal with that kind of? I guess there's new kinds of banks like Chime and things like that have that more radical approach. But how does a traditional company look at this and go, oh, I want to embrace this. I want to change for my, up and coming employees who want to be accepted. Who are
my up and coming, customers also, or at
exactly because they're like, they don't really understand their customers at all. I mean, they're like way over here and the customers are over here, and they just won't come over here, but they need to in order to survive.
So I think that it takes and this is one of the things that I think is going to be a major trend that we've talked a lot about diversity and inclusion. Those words are actually the wrong words, though, quite frankly. I think belonging is much, much better, because even inclusion implies a power dynamic. I'm choosing to include you. Right. Belonging, you just belong. And I think that is a fundamental shift that will require much more intentional work and development. By the way, when someone belongs, you aren't, just because it doesn't work for you, we have to think about how do we redistribute teams to be, and even allow for the self-creation, which happens in some instances, but again, it's with these certain parameters. Who do you like? You know, who I think asking these questions about preference, understanding, you know, what does your workforce look like? What is the health of your organization in terms of these different areas and balances? Health of your organization isn't just your bench strength, and it isn't just the financial strength, or that's not your organization's health. It's understanding whether or not your organization has resiliency. And resiliency has to come from, you know, this understanding. Do you have enough people who prefer to work late? Do you have enough people who prefer to work with others versus alone? Because that difference and that diversity is actually what creates the openness. Yep. And if you don't, and that requires, by the way, it starts, I was talking to someone not too long ago, you know, how about job interviews? I said, oh, by the time you get to a job interview, it's too late. It's how you set up who you bring into an organization. It's what's your pool. It's all of these other kinds of things that are even more important. If you're thinking about, I want to have more, you know, I want to make sure that I have a more, you know, inclusive interview process, that's too late.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm with you. The whole talent acquisition process is another thing that needs to be
even acquisition
disrupted. It is
lending.
Like the whole concept of a, you know, resumes, screening calls, interviews, all of that stuff. As far as I'm concerned, you know, we should bring back the apprentice model. It's like, does this person think that they can do the job? Sure, let's bring them in for a bit, try them out, see how they actually work within the group, how they actually work. And then, you know, you can go back to them and say, okay, this is going to work. This is not going to work, you know, retroactively pay them for the work or whatever. But the whole system is just bad.
But artisanship and apprenticeship are actually models, I think, that do work better and that lend themselves. If you think about the fact that, you know, we were out, it was agrarian, and then we moved people into factories. I think that the next generation of worker will be based on apprenticeship. Look at the cost of universities. Look at how universities are rethinking themselves.
Exactly.
It's not, other than music, where you sort of see the world in which their, you know, apprenticeship truly exists. You find a musician, you like how they work, you like who, you know, their style, and that's who you end up studying with. That world is sort of what we need in the workplace as well. Whether it's, you know, hey, we're going to have an open house, meet with some people, or, you know, virtual or physical, it doesn't really matter, honestly. Yeah. But where you actually can see, oh, I'd like to work with this person, instead of formalized mentorship programs. Yes, we're going to pair you up with someone who's, you know, this, so that they can teach you a lesson or whatever. It's like, really, you know, we got to teach some of the oldsters about, you know, about technology. So we're going to, you know, hook them up with
show you how TikTok works, right?
Really? It has nothing to do with that. But so I think fundamentally what has to change is a shift in an understanding also of the value of people.
Yeah.
People
and the value of the alternative mindsets, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm going to dismiss that person because they're not thinking the way I'm thinking. And it should be the opposite.
Exactly. It's the whole notion of a culture add instead of a culture fit. And even just it's the whole notion of acquiring. If you think about it, people are lending you their talents for a period of time, and that period of time will depend on what they get from you as an organization or as a person or as a mentee or any of those things. And that, I think, is a fundamental challenge that has been lost. Even the notion of leadership. We know that the kinds of leaders that the newer entrants into the workforce are much more comfortable with are those that will have conversations. It's not about millennials or Gen Zers who want more attention. It's that they value their own opinion sometimes maybe more than they should at certain times, and that's okay. You know, I've got a Gen Zer or Gen Zer and a millennial. Both are working in very, very different ways. One's a freelancer, the other one works for a company.
Yeah.
And so
all good.
Yeah, it is, exactly. But I think it's that idea that fundamentally organizations are still not comfortable with, or workplaces are still not comfortable with that level of autonomy and that level of interaction. And you see people saying, oh, they always have, you know, they've got so many demands. I said, part of that has as much to do with boredom and a concern that you don't understand where they're coming from, because it's much more about, especially after some of what, you know, Gen Zers, I mean, even the generation thing is a little bit odd, but people who sort of have really are newer entrants into the workforce, they have often lived through, you know, parents losing jobs in 2008, and now, you know, not being able to graduate necessarily, or this whole remote world, and thinking to themselves, wow, my son is a great example. He actually said at one point, he said, wow, so if I had taken a job over there and it closed down now, where would I be? I'd be living over there where I don't want to be. I'd rather actually live where I want to live and figure out how to work from here instead.
And that's possible now. And unfortunately, we had to have this disruption to have these things occur. And unfortunately, it's kind of like the same thing with everything. It's like, unless there's some cataclysmic event, nothing seems to change. So
it's very true. I think there had been some shifts. I think that, you know, AI was making a lot of noise. I think this idea that the workforce itself, we were going to, and we are still facing a massive workforce shortage. You know, if you just look at population patterns and everything. So yes, there are a lot of people who are unemployed, but that's temporary, quite honestly. And it's the underemployment in certain areas, overemployment in other areas, those kinds of things that need to work out. But the reality is we do have a shortage of workforce, and that will continue to be a problem, especially in the next few years. It's going to be massive as, you know, the population ages. And so that to me is a much, much bigger issue. And so this is a blip. People are like, oh no, but everyone's going to be coming back looking for work and they'll take anything. I'm like, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. I don't think people are going to take anything. I think on the contrary, you're going to have a harder time finding certain kinds of workers without flexibility, without hybrid situations, without all of those things. So I think it's time for not just HR departments, because this has to come from anyone who interacts with others. And humans are overall social beings. And so anyone who has, whether it's a formal or an informal leadership role, has to take stock at what their interactions are going to be and what they're going to be able to live with and be comfortable with. One of the things, this one really, really gets me, is I don't believe we're very comfortable with this notion of intermittent productivity. And humans, by definition, will have these periods of hyperproductivity and less. And whether it's cyclical in terms of someone's familial life or financial life, or even just, you know, their mental, you know, level of interest in things, we have to be comfortable with that. And now we have this additional pressure that a third of the millions of people who have gotten COVID are going to be looking to work in an intermittently productive way because of long haul COVID. And I don't hear any organizations, we hear a lot of, wow, there's this thing, it's called long haul COVID, but how are we dealing with that as organizations? Are we going to cast people aside? Are we going to say, hey, yeah, sorry, you're not, you know, too bad. It's not going to work out for us, because every month you have a couple days where you actually can't stand up or even, you know, do anything. Or you've got too much pain, all these things. And we're not talking about that. And it's like, this is crazy.
We're still treating people like machines. We're still treating them like machines. I mean, and this broke it up a bit, but it's still going, like, if you hear people like Google saying, oh, our offices are reopening, we expect you to come back. It's like, this is supposedly an innovative organization that's right on the cutting edge, but they still want you to come back to the office. What's going on here?
And they're spending millions and millions to reinvent what might be more comfortable. And it's interesting. You see that, you know, I been lucky enough to be in New York, and you can see New York sort of opening up, but you still also see, it's like, wow, I talked to a restaurant, a restaurant owner. He's like, yeah, nobody wants to sit inside. Yeah, people are traumatized. Give them some time. Some may get there. It's like, even if they're vaccinated, we're all vaccinated. People don't want to sit inside. I said, I get it, but what do you can't force them in that case. So
yeah, they'll eventually want to go back to that again.
Exactly.
And people will want, you see, I think this is great because I'm in California, and there's so many restaurants that didn't have outdoor dining. And now they were forced to have outdoor dining. Now they're petitioning to leave the outdoor dining there. And I'm like,
sidewalks of New York
in the first place. The weather's great.
Exactly. Like, it's very, very true. No, I think that's one of those examples. We can't force this, and there is sort of this psychic trauma that we have to respect and recognize before just assuming, everyone's, everything's going to go back to normal. Normal wasn't really that normal.
Yeah.
And it wasn't.
Well, it goes back to thinking about humans as opposed to machines that have to fit into a particular, slot. Anyway, so now it's time. Okay.
That are going to do that. By the way, there are enough machines that are going to be able to do that for us, that can fit into these old patterns. So.
Yeah, exactly. So now it's time. Think like a futurist. It's 2031, 10 years from now. What's the world going to be like in 10 years? I want to hear your thoughts.
So in 10 years, I believe we will have fully transitioned into the location optional world of work.
Wow, I love your optimism.
I think in 10 years, we will have had to, and that's why I think the next 5 years are going to be incredibly painful. And and I think that a lot of organizations will lose their edge and lose the people because as a result of sort of that stubbornness. No, people want to be together in the same place. I'm like, yeah, sometimes, but not all the time.
Yeah.
And that lack of flexibility, I think. So I think we will fully transition to the location optional world of work. And so what we need now is we will have rejected, I think, the traditional boundaries, and in favor of, I think you said work anywhere, of vans, of farms. We will be able to work anywhere. And I think that what we'll have are spaces that are hosted by organizations for individuals, but hosting, not owned by, not corporate real estate, but actually hosted events that are much less of, it's an all team meeting that anyone must go to, but there will be sort of the temporal aspect is we're going to host events, whether they're geographic or there could be spaces that will be hosted in which people can exchange ideas, have that sort of, and people will learn as a result of that to sort of bring those ideas to those experiences and to those sorts of, workspace hosted kinds of experiences. And so I think that is going to be important. I also think that, in 10 years, people will have figured out how to essentially consumerize themselves in a more, I think, in a more concrete way. Yeah. So if you think about that, that's sort of the extreme commercialization of the self, right? The individuals will say, this is what I'm going to offer up. These are the things you can bid on my skills. You can bid on my ability to do this and bring it. And this is what I can show of that. And I think also we will have moved to, again, and this to me is the essence of workforce fluidity. It's post-temporal, post-geographic. It's all of these things really where individuals will say, this is what I bring. Are you interested? Yes or no? This is how you can bid for it. And this is the amount of time. And this is what you'll get for it as a result. And so the idea of, having a resume won't really matter. We'll have our portable identity, and we will share the parts of it that are relevant to individuals. The veracity will be based on, you can get certain things validated, but that will be the proof rather than this sort of interpretation or, hey, I like you. You're more like me, I'm going to hire you. So that's what I think the world of work will be in, or will be in 10 years.
Well, I'd love to see some kind of more of like an apprentice model too, where, forget the resume, just like start working, see how you do, you should know within a very short period of time whether this person is going to be able to mesh with the organization or not. Right.
And, or even more so, if you need what because oftentimes they don't mesh with the organization, and that's exactly what you want.
Yeah, exactly.
I have people ask me all the time, it's like, yeah, but that person doesn't really fit. That person isn't at the same level as the rest of your team. I'm like, I want that person's views in this setting.
That's right. Cultural fit actually is no cultural fit is a good thing.
Exactly. But I think, but again, that's going to require the desire on the part of leaders and individuals to put themselves in those uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
And yet, what's more uncomfortable than what we've lived through over the past, 20 or so months? It's been fantastic and wonderful and horrible all at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what happens with disruption, right?
It's true.
It goes in all different directions, and we just have to work to make sure that it's better in the end.
Yeah.
So
if we come out of this and go back to the way things were, then what a failed opportunity.
Oh yeah, that would be awful.
We will have had. That would be the worst. I think there are enough people who don't want that to be the case. I think there are enough people who have experienced a taste of a different kind of autonomy.
Yeah.
And some of it has been really, really difficult, but at the same time, it's your own difficulty that you're living in.
Yeah.
And it is up to you to a certain extent to make that, we all can just shut our computers off. Yeah. We choose not to, and we choose to be tied to them. Yeah. So those of us who are brave enough to say, I'm done at this, that's it, great. But I know that for me, that flexibility is critical.
So do you remember the book by Dan Pink called Free Agent Nation? He wrote back in 2002. Yeah. And I'm like, this guy he's prescient. It's exactly right, but he's totally wrong on the timing, because that's the problem with futurists.
Yeah, it's true.
We know what's going to happen. We just don't know when. It's like being a meteorologist, right? Oh, it's going to rain. Oh, well, we're not quite sure when.
Yeah, there's actually a book, and there was an article written, I think co-authored by Doc Searles, specifically about agency also, and how instead of shopping, stores and people who have their products will actually offer those up. And that was in the 90s. So clearly that was way too prescient. But at the same time, I don't know that anyone saw how easily individuals could say, yeah, this is what I do here. Although those of us who have been parents know, you wear your parental hat, you wear your this hat, you wear all these different hats. And we're all
multiple humans, not just one.
But we do this in life, and yet we rarely translate that, which is so natural in life, to work. And that's where I think this whole notion of it's life work. It's not work technology, it's life work. Because if we're looking for individuals, it has to support both. And it has to ignite interest and passion in both of those arenas of your world, or it's not gonna work.
Yeah. Well, it's all blended together now, right? I mean, we don't have the monolithic work anymore. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, there's some people who still do that. They go, oh, you know what? I'm at my desk and I'm not going to do anything else. And then, but I think this is the best time to take the opportunity to break it up into chunks, and, do the best work when you do your best work, and then do something else when you don't. And it actually brings in more innovation, because you're weaving together different threads, and you're creating juxtapositions and all these things that were never there before when you were sitting at your desk staring at your screen all day.
Exactly. So if you say, hey, I'm going to get up, I've been sitting at staring at my screen for too long, I'm going to go take a walk. And then you see somebody doing something that you never would have expected, and you bring that back. It's a far more enriching perspective that you're bringing to work that never would have happened if you were sitting in an office either. Yeah. And so I think those are some of the things. This whole notion of balance is absurd. We all know that there is no balance. It's actually an integration completely, or a melding of these, where you're all in for one at one moment, and then you're out completely. Ideally, I think it's this struggle of trying, like the illusion of balance, that creates, stress, and it creates sort of poorer outcomes overall for everyone.
Yeah. What it's making me think is that we really need to have like a whole new series of organizations that ascribe to this as sort of like a vanguard, because the organizations that are out there today, none of them, even the ones that are most forward thinking, aren't really there. Because if they're still saying, you got to go back to the office, you have to be together, blah, 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 then you know that they just don't get it. So we almost need a whole new set of organizations to actually show the way, and then let them either take over or let the other organizations learn from them in order to.
There'll be a brain drain from the other organizations. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that those organizations that say, hey, by the way, work wherever you want, that's what's going to be, because that is still being used as a carrot for a level of productivity. So I do think it's a rethinking at a foundational level that rethinks the nature of work, assignments, and that sort of individual and work contract that needs to happen. Because again, right now when you see it, it's like, oh, that's a very, very progressive organization. They're not going to force anyone. Well, first of all, financially makes great sense. They're going to get rid of all those leases or owned land that they had, but that doesn't necessarily change fundamentally what is expected. Again,
exactly.
If you think about work and individuals as producers of work and not as individuals who have agency, thought, and more to bring to the equation, then I think it doesn't matter where you work.
Well, and you know what is interesting
reinvention
is that if you think about it, film, movies, Hollywood, they're already doing this. This model is already there where they come together for a project. Everyone's a free agent. And then when the project's over, everybody, dissipates again. And it's like the model's there. We just need to use it for other organizations as well.
100%. I wrote about that in a blog in 2017, actually.
You're a futurist.
That the model was there. It's like, look, identity is fluid, jobs are fluid, organizations are fluid. And I think that's probably this idea of working for someone. This is where I actually think that's going to be the biggest shift also. So if we are truly in a post-location sort of an environment, the boundaries between organizations have to change. This isn't your competitor. The product is a competitive product, but it's not that the organization is a competitor. Because look at healthcare. Nurses will work for competing hospitals.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
They're going to do across the board. Like actors will work on competing movies, but is it really competition? So it's even that notion of competition that has to change. So you're right, but that's where it's so fundamental to how an organization sees what it's creating and what is, viable. Are you selling services? Or are you selling products? That means you have a different approach overall.
Yeah. No, I'd love
to see that. It's going to be exciting though. It's going to be a little painful. I think the next few years are going to be pretty painful though, I have to say.
Painful and exciting. So
yes, absolutely.
We live in interesting times, right?
We do.
More interesting than usual right now.
Yeah, I think so. The kind of disruption we've had is such that the kind of innovation, it's just going to be phenomenal. But I know that what each and every individual can do though, is take on sort of an experiment or actually make it happen within their workplace. Like I had my whole team, I said, I scheduled a full day meeting and they're like, so what is this meeting? Are we supposed to get together for this? And I said, well, actually, since you're asking all these silly questions, not silly questions, but since you're asking these questions, it's a day off. And I know that you're all so focused that you wouldn't take a day off. So that's a day off. And they're like, oh.
I love it.
total shock. They're like, really? Okay, I guess. I'm like, and I know that if I left the day open and you would have filled it with meetings.
Yeah, exactly. No, this is great. This is great. I love it. Well, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I love the conversation. This is great. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
You can get in touch with me on Twitter, Cecile HCM, and also LinkedIn. Or you can contact me directly at cecile.leroux@ukg.com. I am always happy to hear about, random thoughts and ideas and happy to have conversations with anyone. So
this is great. We should definitely do this again. There's so much more we can talk about because there's so many things that need to be disrupted.
We're going to talk about disrupting archaeology next. Right?
Oh yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.